The B-36 Peacemaker was conceived in an atmosphere of strategic uncertainty during the darkest years of the Second World War. By 1941, even before the United States had entered the war, American planners understood the vulnerability of global supply routes and the potential for conflict to stretch across continents. The German conquest of much of Europe, combined with Japan's expansion in Asia, raised the possibility that Britain, or overseas bases closer to Europe, might fall, leaving the United States without forward airfields from which to strike Axis targets. The Army Air Forces pressed for a bomber that could carry heavy payloads across intercontinental ranges, striking deep into enemy territory directly from North America. This vision demanded an aircraft far larger and more capable than anything then in existence. The responsibility for meeting this requirement fell to Consolidated Aircraft, later known as Convair. The company had already produced the B-24 Liberator, a long-range heavy bomber, but the new challenge required unprecedented innovation. Specifications issued in 1941 called for an aircraft capable of carrying at least 10,000 pounds of bombs, a distance of 10,000 miles at high altitudes beyond the reach of enemy defenses. This range requirement effectively meant transatlantic or trans-Pacific strikes, something no aircraft of the era could attempt with such a payload. Chief designer Robert Widmer and his team began to explore configurations that would maximize lift and efficiency. The resulting design was massive, a wingspan of 230 feet, longer than that of any previous bomber, and a length exceeding 160 feet. To power such an aircraft, 6 Pratt & Whitney R4360 radial piston engines were chosen, each among the largest reciprocating engines ever built. Uniquely, the engines were mounted in a pusher configuration, driving the propellers from the trailing edge of the wing to reduce drag across the wing surface. Later designs would incorporate additional jet engines to provide extra thrust during takeoff and combat operations. The projected size and complexity of the aircraft introduced enormous engineering challenges. The bomb bays had to be designed to carry both conventional ordnance and, eventually, the massive early nuclear weapons developed under the Manhattan Project. Structural engineers wrestled with issues of weight distribution, stress across the long wings, and the problem of providing pressurized crew compartments in a bomber of such unprecedented scale. The solution was a tubular pressurized tunnel connecting the forward and rear crew stations, allowing personnel to move between sections of the aircraft in flight without exposure to altitude extremes. As work progressed, wartime conditions delayed immediate development. Priority was given to proven bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-29 Superfortress, which could be produced quickly for combat operations. The B-36 project continued in the background, with prototypes under construction but no urgent demand for production until the war's later stages. By 1944, with Allied advances in Europe and the Pacific reducing the need for an intercontinental bomber, the program risked cancellation. Yet far-sighted leaders in the Army Air Forces insisted on continuing development, anticipating a post-war world in which the United States might face new adversaries without forward bases. This persistence proved decisive. By the time the war ended, the B-36 was already shaping into a strategic weapon suited not to the Second World War, but to the emerging Cold War. With the Soviet Union replacing Germany and Japan as the principal potential adversary, the need for a long-range nuclear delivery system became urgent. The B-29, though advanced, lacked the intercontinental range required to strike targets deep within the Soviet Union without overseas bases. The B-36, with its immense wingspan, vast fuel capacity, and heavy payload, suddenly emerged as the only available design capable of fulfilling that role. Thus, the origins of the B-36 Peacemaker reflected both immediate wartime anxieties and long-term strategic foresight. Conceived as a safeguard against the loss of overseas bases, it became the foundation of America's first truly intercontinental nuclear strike capability. What began as an experimental response to Axis advances evolved into one of the central weapon systems of the early Cold War, embodying the shift from conventional to nuclear strategic thinking in military aviation. The prototype and testing era of the B-36 was marked by both engineering triumphs and daunting challenges. The first completed prototype, designated XB-36, rolled out in 1945 at Convair's plant in Fort Worth, Texas. Its sheer size immediately drew attention. With a wingspan of 230 feet, longer than the height of the U.S. Capitol building, it dwarfed every other bomber then in existence. The fuselage stretched over 160 feet, and the empty weight alone exceeded 160,000 pounds. The aircraft was designed not merely to be bigger, but to be a technological leap that could cross oceans without refueling while carrying bomb loads unmatched by any operational bomber of the era. The first flight took place on the 8th of August 1946 with test pilot Beryl Erickson at the controls. The B-36 lifted off from Fort Worth and flew for 37 minutes, revealing both the promise and the challenges of the design. Its 6 Pratt & Whitney R4000 360 Wasp major engines, mounted in a rear-facing pusher configuration, provided immense thrust but also generated heat and maintenance problems. The long wings flexed visibly in flight, though structural testing showed they could endure heavy loads. Pressurized crew compartments, connected by a narrow, pressurized tunnel with a wheeled trolley, functioned as intended, offering some comfort for crews expected to spend more than a day in the air. Testing quickly revealed the complexities of operating an aircraft of such size. The R4000 360 engines were powerful but temperamental, prone to overheating and difficult to service due to their placement behind the wings. The massive landing gear posed another challenge. Each main gear assembly was originally designed with a single enormous tire nearly 9 feet tall, which severely limited the number of airfields that could support the aircraft. Engineers were forced to redesign the system with 4 smaller wheels per bogie to distribute weight more evenly, allowing the bomber to operate from more runways. Performance evaluations produced mixed results. The B-36 demonstrated the ability to cruise at high altitudes well above 40,000 feet, making interception by piston engine fighters nearly impossible at the time. Its range exceeded 10,000 miles under test conditions, validating the original intercontinental concept. However, its speed was modest, with a top speed of about 300 miles per hour, significantly slower than emerging jet fighters. Critics within the Air Force questioned whether such a large, slow bomber could survive in an era when jet-powered interceptors were beginning to appear. Convair responded with continuous refinements. Later prototypes, designated YB-36, introduced improvements in engine cooling, cockpit visibility, and armament systems. Defensive gun turrets, controlled remotely, were tested with a combination of 20 mm cannons positioned across the fuselage and tail. These systems added complexity but were considered necessary given the aircraft's size and vulnerability. At the same time, aerodynamic refinements sought to reduce drag and improve cruising efficiency, though speed would remain a limitation throughout the aircraft's career. By 1948, testing had advanced sufficiently to allow transition to production models. The B-36A, the first production version, was delivered to the U.S. Air Force that year. It lacked combat capability and was used primarily for crew training and familiarization. The B-36B, which followed shortly after, introduced full operational systems, including a bomb bay capable of carrying the Mark 17 hydrogen bomb, an enormous weapon that no other bomber could accommodate at the time. Despite persistent doubts, the testing phase demonstrated that the B-36 was not simply a scaled-up B-29, but a fundamentally new class of strategic bomber. Its combination of payload and range made it the only aircraft capable of delivering nuclear weapons across continents in the late 1940s. Though hampered by engine troubles and relatively slow speed, the bomber's strengths aligned closely with America's emerging nuclear strategy. Testing had proven the aircraft could do what no other could: carry unprecedented bomb loads from the continental United States to targets across Eurasia without refueling and return. This capability alone justified its entry into production and secured its role in the early nuclear deterrent force. The B-36 entered service with the newly established United States Air Force in 1948, becoming the first true intercontinental strategic bomber in history. Its initial deployment was with the 7th Bombardment Wing at Carswell Air Force Base in Fort Worth, Texas, where crews began the arduous process of mastering an aircraft unlike any they had flown before. The sheer scale of the Peacemaker demanded new procedures, from maintenance and fueling to flight planning and navigation. With missions expected to last more than 30 hours, the B-36 required specialized training for flight crews, who had to adapt to long endurance operations at altitudes above 40,000 feet. The early production B-36B, the first operational model, arrived in squadrons in mid-1948. Each aircraft carried a bomb load of up to 86,000 pounds, greater than that of any other bomber in existence, and could deliver the massive atomic and later thermonuclear weapons that form the core of America's strategic arsenal. The bomb bays were cavernous enough to carry two of the largest nuclear weapons of the era, making the B-36 the only aircraft capable of delivering the hydrogen bomb until the arrival of the B-52 several years later. This ability placed the Peacemaker at the center of America's nuclear deterrent strategy during the early Cold War. For pilots and crews, the transition was daunting. The aircraft's 6 pusher radial engines gave it a distinctive appearance and sound, but they also generated frequent maintenance demands and unique handling characteristics. Flight crews quickly discovered that managing engine performance, fuel consumption, and the heavy control loads over missions lasting more than a day required exceptional discipline. Pressurized compartments, unusual in earlier bombers, allowed crews to operate in relative comfort at extreme altitudes, connected by a pressurized tunnel with a trolley that ran above the bomb bays. Even so, long flights placed intense strain on airmen, and fatigue became a recurring issue in training and operational sorties. Operational trials soon highlighted both the strengths and weaknesses of the B-36. Its ability to fly above most jet interceptors of the late 1940s and early 1950s made it effectively untouchable in the early years of its career. At the same time, its speed remained a concern, cruising at roughly 230 miles per hour and with a top speed of just over 400, the B-36 was significantly slower than the new jet fighters appearing in Soviet service. Air Force leaders recognized that the bomber's survivability would depend on altitude and range rather than speed. An early operational doctrine emphasized flying above 40,000 feet where few adversaries could reach it. The bomber's massive defensive armament was also put to the test. B-36S carried as many as 16 20mm cannons mounted in remotely operated turrets across the fuselage, nose, and tail. Although impressive on paper, these systems added weight and complexity, and many were later removed as the aircraft's reliance on altitude rather than defensive firepower became clearer. Nonetheless, the weaponry reflected lingering fears from World War II that large bombers would be vulnerable to swarms of fighters. Strategically, the B-36 quickly became central to the United States' nuclear posture. The creation of the Strategic Air Command, SAC, under General Curtis LeMay coincided with the Peacemaker's entry into service, and the two became inseparable. SAC's mission was global nuclear deterrence, and the B-36 was the only aircraft capable of delivering on that promise until the mid-1950s. Crews trained constantly for long-range missions, simulating strikes against targets deep in the Soviet Union. While the aircraft was never used in combat, its very existence projected power, signaling that the United States could deliver nuclear weapons anywhere on Earth without reliance on overseas bases. The B-36's entry into service was not without controversy. Critics within Congress and the Navy argued that the bomber was too slow, too expensive, and vulnerable to the new generation of jet interceptors. The so-called Revolt of the Admirals in 1949, a major inter-service dispute, focused partly on the B-36, with naval leaders questioning whether strategic bombers could truly ensure national security compared to aircraft carriers and naval aviation. Despite the heated debate, the B-36 survived and expanded its role, thanks in large part to the strategic vision of SAC and the pressing need for nuclear delivery systems in the early Cold War. By the early 1950s, dozens of B-36S were in service, spread across multiple bomber wings. Their immense wingspans and sheer size made them dominating presences on airfields, and their operational role placed them at the forefront of U.S. strategic doctrine. Though never tested in actual nuclear combat, their presence alone reshaped global military calculations. The entry of the B-36 into service marked the beginning of a new era, the age of intercontinental nuclear deterrence, in which the survival of nations would rest on the capabilities of bombers like the Peacemaker. As the B-36 Peacemaker matured in service, its operational use reflected both its unique capabilities and the strategic environment of the early Cold War. Unlike the heavy bombers of the Second World War, the B-36 was never employed in direct combat operations, but it played a central role in deterrence, readiness, and the evolving doctrine of nuclear warfare. Strategic Air Command, SAC, under the leadership of General Curtis LeMay, turned the aircraft into the backbone of America's nuclear striking force, assigning it to constant alert duty and training for missions that simulated long-range nuclear strikes against the Soviet Union. In practice, this meant that the B-36 flew thousands of hours in peacetime missions that tested endurance, range, and survivability. Crews often undertook flights lasting 30 to 40 hours, circling remote targets or crossing oceans before returning to their home bases. These missions were designed not only to train crews, but also to demonstrate to allies and adversaries alike that the United States possessed an aircraft capable of delivering nuclear weapons anywhere in the world without refueling. During these exercises, B-36s often carried full bomb loads of inert or conventional ordnance to test weight and handling, though nuclear weapons remained in storage until needed. The bomber's primary strength was altitude and range. Operating above 40,000 feet, the B-36 could fly beyond the reach of most early jet interceptors and surface-to-air defenses. At the time of its introduction, Soviet fighters lacked the performance to consistently challenge a bomber at such heights, and this gave the Peacemaker a decisive edge. Its range, exceeding 10,000 miles, allowed it to take off from U.S. bases and strike targets deep inside the Soviet Union without relying on foreign bases, a capability that no other aircraft in the world could match in the late 1940s and early 1950s. But operational experience also revealed limitations. The Peacemaker's speed, topping out at just over 400 miles per hour, was significantly slower than that of emerging Soviet MiG-15 jet fighters. As Soviet air defenses improved, SAC planners recognized that altitude alone could not guarantee survival. Exercises demonstrated that interception was becoming increasingly likely, especially as jet technology advanced. To mitigate this, the Air Force began developing tactics that emphasized electronic countermeasures, long-range escorts, and eventually standoff weapons. In the meantime, the B-36's immense payload allowed it to carry the largest nuclear weapons then available, weapons so heavy and bulky that no other aircraft could accommodate them. This ensured its continuing relevance even as speed became a growing concern. The B-36 also played a role in conventional operations, though never in combat. Its capacity to carry up to 86,000 pounds of bombs made it theoretically capable of devastating conventional strikes. Training exercises included massive simulated raids where dozens of B-36s would launch together, demonstrating an ability to deliver overwhelming firepower. These drills reinforced SAC's strategy of saturation bombing, a doctrine carried over from World War II, but adapted for nuclear conditions. Even though the bomber was designed primarily for nuclear delivery, its ability to carry massive conventional loads gave planners flexibility in hypothetical scenarios that envisioned large-scale wars not escalating to nuclear exchange. Not all missions were straightforward. B-36 crews undertook probe flights along the edges of Soviet airspace, gathering intelligence on radar coverage, reaction times, and interceptor performance. These missions, often shrouded in secrecy, were dangerous even though they did not involve actual combat. They contributed to the growing body of knowledge on Soviet air defenses and influenced the development of future bombers and tactics. Operationally, the aircraft gained a reputation among its crews as both impressive and demanding. The 6 piston engines, later supplemented by 4 jet engines on some variants, required constant monitoring and maintenance. Missions lasting more than a day tested both human endurance and machine reliability. Crews often joked about the 6 turning and 4 burning configuration, referring to the piston and jet engines working together, but behind the humor was recognition of the complexity of flying and maintaining one of the largest aircraft ever built. Despite its limitations, the B-36 was central to America's nuclear deterrence in the early 1950s. Its sheer size, range, and payload made it a credible threat at a time when intercontinental ballistic missiles did not yet exist. The bomber never dropped a bomb in anger, but it served as a constant reminder of American strategic reach. Every flight was a statement of capability, and every squadron on alert reinforced the doctrine of deterrence. In this sense, the combat role of the B-36 was psychological and strategic rather than kinetic. It never engaged in the sort of daylight raids that defined the B-17 or B-29, yet its existence altered the balance of power in the Cold War. The Peacemaker's operational use demonstrated that air power was no longer limited by geography, and that for the first time the United States could threaten an adversary's homeland directly from its own territory. This role as a symbol of intercontinental nuclear deterrence defined the B-36's combat legacy, one shaped not by battles fought, but by wars prevented. As the B-36 matured in service, Convair and the United States Air Force introduced a wide range of variants to address operational challenges, extend performance, and adapt the aircraft to emerging strategic needs. Each successive model reflected both technical refinements and the rapidly changing demands of the Cold War environment. From its earliest production versions to the final jet-assisted hybrids, the Peacemaker became one of the most extensively modified bombers of its generation. The first true production models were the B-36B and B-36D. The B-36B introduced full combat capabilities, including defensive gun turrets and operational bomb bays capable of carrying both conventional and nuclear ordnance. Yet it quickly became clear that more power was needed to meet the demands of heavy payloads and long missions. This led to the B-36D, which added 4 General Electric J-47 turbojet engines in underwing pods to supplement the 6 Pratt & Whitney R4360 piston engines. This hybrid arrangement, 6 piston engines pushing from the rear of the wing and 4 jets pulling from the front, gave rise to the famous description 6 turning and 4 burning. The addition of jet power improved takeoff performance, climb rate, and combat survivability, addressing many of the earlier concerns about speed and interception. Subsequent models introduced incremental improvements in systems and structure. The B-36F and B-36H incorporated uprated piston engines, more powerful jet boosters, and enhanced electronic countermeasure suites. These improvements allowed the bomber to fly higher, with better fuel efficiency and greater resilience against radar-directed defenses. Defensive armament was gradually reduced as reliance on altitude and electronic warfare increased, and by the time of later versions, many of the remotely operated turrets were removed entirely to save weight and improve performance. The definitive version of the Peacemaker was the B-36J, introduced in the mid-1950s. This variant featured expanded fuel capacity, strengthened wings, and reinforced landing gear. It could carry larger payloads and had improved range compared to its predecessors. The J model was the last and most advanced bomber before the type's retirement, bridging the transition to the jet-powered Boeing B-52 Stratofortress. For much of its service, the B-36J remained the only aircraft capable of delivering the heaviest hydrogen bombs, ensuring its continued importance even as jets began to dominate. Specialized adaptations expanded the Peacemaker's role beyond bombing. The RB-36 series, developed for strategic reconnaissance, became one of the largest reconnaissance aircraft ever built. Fitted with high-resolution cameras and electronic intelligence equipment, these variants conducted long-range missions gathering critical data on Soviet defenses. Some were equipped with special side-looking radar systems, while others carried mapping gear for charting vast areas of the Arctic and Pacific. The RB-36 fleet underscored the aircraft's value not only as a bomber, but also as an indispensable intelligence-gathering tool during the early Cold War. Other specialized versions included the GRB-36, configured to carry a McDonnell XF-85 Goblin parasite fighter as an escort. Though the concept of a bomber carrying its own protective fighter was eventually abandoned, the experiments highlighted the Air Force's concern over the Peacemaker's vulnerability to interceptors. Another project, the FICON Fighter Conveyor Program, tested the carriage of Republic RF-84 Thunderflash fighters inside the B-36's bomb bay for long-range reconnaissance escort missions. While technically impressive, these schemes were rendered obsolete by advances in aerial refueling and long-range jet escorts. The Peacemaker also served as a platform for testing new technologies. EB-36 variants carried electronic countermeasure systems, while others were used in radar calibration and nuclear weapons development trials. Some B-36s were converted to training aircraft, designated TB-36, to ease the burden on frontline bombers and prepare crews for the unique demands of intercontinental operations. Altogether, more than 380 B-36s were built, encompassing a diverse range of models and modifications. Each represented an evolution in Cold War strategy, adapting to advances in nuclear weapons, improvements in air defense systems, and the transition from piston to jet power. While no single version of the Peacemaker was perfect, the collective development of its variants demonstrated the Air Force's determination to keep the bomber relevant through constant adaptation. In the broader history of aviation, the B-36's development path exemplified the last great flowering of piston engine technology, combined with the dawn of the jet age. Its variants illustrate the struggle of an airframe designed in the Second World War to remain viable in a world of supersonic fighters, radar-guided defenses, and intercontinental nuclear standoffs. Through continual innovation, the B-36 remained America's primary strategic bomber for nearly a decade, bridging the gap until the all-jet B-52 could assume the role. The global impact and legacy of the B-36 Peacemaker must be understood within the unique context of the early Cold War, when nuclear deterrence became the defining element of American military strategy. Though it never dropped a bomb in combat, the B-36 played a decisive role in shaping the balance of power between the United States and the Soviet Union during the critical years before intercontinental ballistic missiles were operational. The Peacemaker's most immediate impact was strategic credibility. Between 1948 and the mid-1950s, it was the only aircraft capable of delivering nuclear or thermonuclear weapons to targets deep inside Soviet territory directly from bases in the continental United States. No foreign basing was necessary, which meant the U.S. could maintain a credible nuclear strike capability even in the event of a political crisis that denied access to overseas airfields. This ability altered Soviet strategic planning, forcing them to invest heavily in air defense systems, radar networks, and long-range interceptors in an effort to counter the perceived threat of the Peacemaker fleet. The aircraft also influenced the organization and doctrine of the United States Air Force. The creation of Strategic Air Command, SAC, under General Curtis LeMay coincided with the B-36's entry into service. The bomber became SAC's flagship, shaping its culture of readiness, discipline, and constant alert status. Exercises involving dozens of B-36s demonstrated the Air Force's ability to conduct global nuclear strikes, reinforcing deterrence by making it clear to adversaries that the United States possessed both the means and the organizational commitment to deliver a retaliatory blow of unprecedented scale. The Chrome Dome concept of continuous airborne alert flights, later applied to B-52s, had its conceptual roots in the Peacemaker's era. Internationally, the B-36 had no direct export history. Its size, cost, and specialized role made it unsuitable for Allied air forces. Instead, America's allies relied on smaller bombers, while the United States alone maintained the B-36 as part of its nuclear monopoly. Yet its presence shaped NATO's strategy indirectly, as European states relied on the credibility of U.S. strategic air power for deterrence against Soviet aggression. In this way, the Peacemaker symbolized American commitment to defending Western Europe during a period when conventional forces were still rebuilding after the devastation of World War II. The B-36 also influenced the development of future aircraft. Its hybrid propulsion system, combining piston and jet engines, was a transitional step in bomber technology, bridging the gap between propeller-driven aircraft of World War II and the jet-powered bombers of the Cold War. Lessons learned from its long-range operations informed the design of the Boeing B-52 Stratofortress, which inherited the mission of intercontinental deterrence while shedding the limitations of piston engines. The emphasis on altitude, range, and payload capacity pioneered by the Peacemaker remained central to strategic bomber design for decades to come. By the mid-1950s, however, the bomber's limitations had become apparent. The introduction of Soviet jet interceptors, radar-guided anti-aircraft weapons, and early surface-to-air missiles eroded its survivability. The B-52, entering service in 1955, offered far greater speed, improved flexibility, and a more modern design, ensuring the Peacemaker's retirement by 1959. Yet its decade of service was not wasted. It provided a bridge between wartime heavy bombers and the modern strategic triad of bombers, submarines, and missiles that came to define nuclear deterrence. Culturally, the B-36 became an icon of American air power in the 1950s. Its immense wingspan, towering presence on airfields, and the distinctive sound of 6 turning and 4 burning engines made it a recognizable symbol of Cold War strength. It even entered popular culture, most famously in the 1955 film Strategic Air Command starring James Stewart, which showcased the aircraft as a technological marvel and a key instrument of national defense. Today, only 4 B-36s survive, preserved in museums in the United States. Their sheer size continues to impress visitors, serving as reminders of a time when intercontinental bombers carried the full weight of America's nuclear deterrent. While later weapon systems overshadowed it in performance and longevity, the Peacemaker's role in maintaining stability during the dangerous early years of the Cold War secures its place in aviation history. Its legacy endures as the first true intercontinental bomber, the aircraft that ensured the United States could project nuclear power globally, and a milestone in the evolution of strategic air power. Beyond its mainline service, the B-36 Peacemaker was involved in a number of lesser-known projects, experimental missions, and developmental pathways that highlight both the ambition and the uncertainty of early Cold War strategic aviation. These chapters, often overshadowed by the aircraft's nuclear deterrent role, reveal how the Peacemaker was used as a test platform, a stopgap for radical concepts, and even as a symbol of inter-service rivalry. One of the most ambitious experiments was the attempt to combine the B-36 with parasite fighters under the FICON, Fighter Conveyor program. Recognizing the bomber's vulnerability to interceptors, planners sought ways to provide long-range escort without relying on aerial refueling, which was still in its infancy. The solution tested was to carry a Republic RF-84K Thunderflash reconnaissance fighter in the bomb bay of a modified GRB-36. The smaller aircraft could be released near hostile airspace, perform reconnaissance or escort duties, and then dock back with the bomber in flight. Though technically impressive, the procedure proved difficult and risky, requiring exceptional piloting skill, and operational practicality was limited. The program was eventually abandoned, but it foreshadowed later aerial refueling and drone control concepts. A related experiment involved the earlier McDonnell XF-85 Goblin parasite fighter. Designed as a tiny, jet-powered Defender carried inside the B-36 or B-29, the Goblin could be launched to protect its mothership against enemy fighters. Tests showed the concept was feasible, but docking in turbulent air was dangerous, and the performance of the Goblin itself was modest compared to full-sized jet fighters. The project was canceled, yet it underscored the extent to which the Air Force sought to extend the survivability of the B-36 by unorthodox means. The B-36 also served as a platform for testing advanced reconnaissance and electronic warfare systems. RB-36 variants carried vast arrays of cameras, side-looking radar, and signals intelligence equipment, flying missions that often pushed the boundaries of legality and secrecy near Soviet airspace. Some of these flights are believed to have gathered critical data on Soviet defenses before the advent of dedicated spy planes like the U-2. Other B-36s were equipped for electronic countermeasure tests, laying the groundwork for the sophisticated ECM suites that later became standard on strategic bombers. Perhaps the most unusual chapter was the intersection of the B-36 with nuclear propulsion research. In the 1950s, Convair and the Air Force explored the possibility of fitting a bomber with a nuclear-powered engine to achieve virtually unlimited endurance. Test aircraft, designated NB-36H, were modified to carry a functioning nuclear reactor in a shielded compartment. Though the reactor did not power the engines directly, it provided data on shielding, radiation effects, and crew safety. Flights with the NB-36H were conducted over sparsely populated areas of Texas, monitored closely by security forces. Ultimately, the risks and complexity of nuclear propulsion ended the project, but the NB-36H demonstrated the Peacemaker's adaptability as a testbed for radical ideas. There were also classified missions in which the B-36 played a role as a psychological weapon. Large formations of Peacemakers flew highly visible long-range exercises, deliberately publicized to demonstrate American reach and intimidate adversaries. Some flights reportedly skirted Soviet air defenses, testing reaction times and probing for weaknesses. While not combat missions in the conventional sense, these operations contributed to the deterrent effect of the aircraft and served as practical intelligence-gathering exercises. Veteran accounts reveal both admiration and frustration with the aircraft. Pilots marveled at its endurance and payload, yet also described the constant maintenance demands of its engines and systems. Ground crews remembered the sheer scale of routine tasks, from changing giant tires to servicing 10 engines. Some crewmen emphasized the strain of missions that lasted more than 36 hours, confined within pressurized compartments with only a small tunnel connecting them to other parts of the aircraft. These details, rarely highlighted in official histories, illuminate the human cost of operating such a vast and complex machine. In retrospect, the B-36's unseen chapters highlight its dual role as both an operational bomber and a laboratory for Cold War innovation. From parasite fighters to nuclear reactors, from electronic espionage to psychological demonstrations of power, the Peacemaker was more than a deterrent platform. It was a bridge into the uncertain future of strategic aviation. While many of its experimental paths ended in dead ends, the lessons learned shaped later aircraft and technologies, ensuring that even its forgotten missions contributed to the trajectory of American air power. By the end of its service life, the B-36 Peacemaker had already secured a unique place in aviation history as the first true intercontinental bomber. Yet its retirement also reflected the rapid pace of technological change during the Cold War. By the late 1950s, the bomber was increasingly overshadowed by jet-powered successors and the emergence of ballistic missile technology, which together transformed strategic doctrine. The Peacemaker, however, left behind a legacy defined by its scale, its strategic role, and its influence on both doctrine and design. The official retirement of the B-36 began in 1958 and concluded in 1959, just over a decade after it had entered operational service. Its replacement, the Boeing B-52 Stratofortress, offered higher speeds, jet propulsion, and greater adaptability to evolving defense systems. The arrival of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, further diminished the role of manned strategic bombers as the primary nuclear delivery vehicle. Yet for nearly 10 years, the B-36 had been the sole aircraft capable of striking any target on Earth directly from U.S. territory, making it the cornerstone of America's nuclear deterrent in a period when no other option existed. For Strategic Air Command, the Peacemaker was more than a weapons platform. It was the embodiment of the Air Force's doctrine of long-range nuclear strike. Its immense range and payload provided credibility to the strategy of deterrence, forcing the Soviet Union to accelerate its air defense development and invest heavily in radar networks, jet interceptors, and eventually surface-to-air missiles. The costs imposed on the Soviet defense system by the threat of the B-36 highlight how the aircraft influenced the broader balance of power, even without ever dropping a bomb in combat. The aircraft also left its mark on the men who operated it. Air crews who flew the Peacemaker described it as both awe-inspiring and demanding. Missions lasting over 30 hours tested human endurance in ways few had experienced before. Ground crews remembered the constant battle with its 6 piston and 4 jet engines, as well as the sheer logistical challenges of maintaining an aircraft of such unprecedented scale. While some regarded it as temperamental and labor-intensive, many veterans took pride in serving aboard an aircraft that represented the pinnacle of piston-powered aviation and a critical component of America's defense. Only 4 complete B-36 airframes survive today, preserved in U.S. museums. Each remains an imposing exhibit, with wingspans that stretch across entire hangars and fuselages towering above visitors. Institutions such as the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, and the Pima Air and Space Museum in Arizona hold Peacemakers as centerpieces of their Cold War collections. These surviving aircraft serve as rare reminders of the scale of the strategic arms race during its earliest years, when deterrence relied not on missiles or stealth but on sheer range, payload, and presence. In the broader history of aviation, the B-36 represents both an end and a beginning. It was the ultimate expression of piston-engine bomber design, pushing reciprocating engine technology to its limits, at a time when the jet age was already underway. At the same time, it served as a transitional platform, bridging the gap to the all-jet B-52, and demonstrating the requirements that future bombers would need to meet in a nuclear world: global reach, massive payloads, and constant readiness. Its hybrid propulsion system, piston engines supplemented by jets, was emblematic of this transitional era, a bridge between 2 technological epochs. Culturally, the Peacemaker also left its imprint. It appeared prominently in the 1955 film Strategic Air Command starring James Stewart, which dramatized its role in America's nuclear defense and introduced its image to a broad public audience. The film reinforced the aircraft's symbolic role as a guardian of national security during the tense early years of the Cold War. Its distinctive phrase, 6 turning and 4 burning, remains one of the most memorable descriptions in aviation lore. The B-36's legacy endures as more than a giant bomber. It was a deterrent weapon that never fought, yet by existing, it helped prevent war. It demonstrated the industrial and technological capacity of the United States to build an aircraft of unprecedented range and power, and it forced adversaries to adapt in ways that shaped the course of the Cold War. Though quickly rendered obsolete by jets and missiles, the Peacemaker remains a monument to a specific moment in history, a moment when the security of the United States, and arguably the peace of the world, rested on the wings of the largest bomber ever built. The legacy of the B-36 Peacemaker cannot be measured in battles fought, since it never dropped a weapon in anger, but rather in the strategic balance it created during its decade of service. As the largest bomber ever to enter operational use, and the first with true intercontinental reach, it set the standard for nuclear deterrence in the years before intercontinental ballistic missiles transformed warfare. Its significance rests in the credibility it gave to Strategic Air Command at a moment when the United States lacked any other means of striking deep into the Soviet Union without forward bases. Operational statistics highlight the scale of its contribution. Between 1948 and 1959, more than 380 aircraft were produced in multiple variants, forming the backbone of America's nuclear strike force. Entire bomber wings were structured around the Peacemaker, with hundreds of crews trained to fly missions lasting 30 to 40 hours across oceans and continents. While no B-36 was ever called into combat, its routine presence on training flights and high-profile exercises signaled to the world that the U.S. had the means to deliver thermonuclear weapons anywhere on the globe. In this sense, every flight was a deterrent action, projecting power without requiring actual use. The influence of the B-36 extended beyond its own service life. It demonstrated that strategic bombers had to operate independently of overseas bases, a principle carried forward by the B-52 and later the B-2 Spirit. It also validated the need for aircraft capable of carrying the very largest nuclear weapons, as early thermonuclear devices could only fit inside the cavernous bomb bays of the Peacemaker. The lessons learned in long-duration flights, crew fatigue management, and global logistics inform both bomber and reconnaissance operations throughout the Cold War. Its existence also reshaped the adversary's strategy. The Soviet Union was compelled to accelerate the development of high-performance interceptors like the MiG-17 and MiG-19, radar-guided flak, and eventually surface-to-air missiles to counter the threat. The appearance of the S-75 Divina, NATO designation SA-2 guideline, in the late 1950s, capable of reaching the high altitudes at which the B-36 cruised, was a direct response to the demands imposed by large strategic bombers. Thus, the Peacemaker inadvertently drove the modernization of Soviet air defenses, which in turn influenced American decisions to transition to faster, higher-flying jet bombers and eventually stealth aircraft. Culturally, the B-36 became an icon of early Cold War anxiety and strength. It appeared not only in Air Force training films and public demonstrations, but also in popular media, most memorably in Strategic Air Command 1955, where its immense size and endurance were showcased to an American audience still adjusting to the realities of nuclear deterrence. To many, it symbolized both the reach of American power and the precarious balance of a world on the edge of atomic conflict. Its nickname, Peacemaker, captured the paradox of a weapon designed to prevent the very war it was built to fight. In retrospect, the B-36 was a transitional machine, the culmination of piston-powered bomber design combined with early jet augmentation serving as a bridge to the all-jet age. It was never as sleek or enduring as the B-52, but without it, the United States would have faced a dangerous gap in strategic capability during the critical years of the late 1940s and early 1950s. Its deterrent effect was real, even if never tested in combat, and it bought the time necessary for more advanced bombers, aerial refueling systems, and missiles to come online. Today, the Peacemaker is remembered less for its operational missions than for its scale, its audacity, and its symbolic role in Cold War history. Preserved examples in museums stand as reminders of a period when the survival of nations depended on massive aircraft lumbering across the stratosphere with nuclear weapons aboard. Though quickly overtaken by new technologies, the B-36 left an enduring mark on aviation and strategy, embodying the transition from World War II bomber concepts to the nuclear age of intercontinental deterrence. By the time the last B-36 Peacemakers were retired in 1959, the aircraft had already defined an era of strategic aviation and left a legacy that extended well beyond its years in service. Its story illustrates not only the evolution of bomber design, but also the larger shift in global security, from conventional wars fought with massed air fleets to the nuclear standoff that dominated the second half of the 20th century. The Peacemaker represented the culmination of piston-engine bomber design, a machine that pushed propeller-driven technology to its absolute limits. Its 6 radial engines and immense wingspan gave it an endurance that no other bomber of its generation could match. The later addition of 4 jet engines marked it as a transitional aircraft, bridging the gap between the propeller age and the jet-powered strategic bombers that would dominate the Cold War. Though the B-52 Stratofortress quickly superseded it in both performance and longevity, the B-36 established the template of what an intercontinental nuclear bomber needed to be: massive, long-ranged, and capable of carrying the largest weapons then imaginable. In strategic terms, the Peacemaker's impact was decisive. It arrived at a time when the United States had no other means of projecting nuclear power across continents. Without it, the early years of the Cold War would have been marked by a dangerous vulnerability in American deterrence. For more than a decade, the B-36 ensured that the Soviet Union faced the reality of a credible U.S. nuclear strike capability. Its very existence deterred potential aggression, fulfilling its name as a peacemaker, not through combat but through the prevention of war. The aircraft also influenced doctrine, training, and infrastructure. Strategic Air Command's rigorous culture of constant readiness was built around the B-36, with crews trained for 40-hour missions and bases adapted to handle its unprecedented size. This culture carried over directly into the era of the B-52, and later the nuclear triad, leaving a permanent mark on the way America prepared for strategic conflict. Lessons from the B-36 era, including the management of crew fatigue, the demands of global logistics, and the integration of electronic warfare, would shape bomber operations for decades. Its cultural footprint was equally significant. To the public, the B-36 embodied Cold War power, massive, almost otherworldly in scale, with its 6-turning and 4-burning engine configuration becoming a familiar phrase in aviation circles. Appearances in films such as Strategic Air Command highlighted its role as a technological marvel and a visible reminder of America's global reach. For those who served on it, memories of long flights, difficult maintenance, and the sheer magnitude of the aircraft remain vivid, reinforcing its reputation as both a challenge and a point of pride. Although only 4 complete B-36s survive in museums today, they stand as monuments to a unique chapter in aviation history. Preserved at sites such as the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Ohio and the Pima Air and Space Museum in Arizona, these aircraft convey the scale and ambition of early nuclear strategy in ways that statistics alone cannot. Visitors confronted with their vast wingspans gain a sense of the technological audacity of the late 1940s, when designers and engineers created an aircraft that seemed almost beyond the limits of possibility. Ultimately, the B-36 Peacemaker's importance rests not in combat records, but in its role as a deterrent and a bridge to the future. It was an aircraft born of World War II fears, perfected in the crucible of the Cold War, and retired as missiles and jet bombers rendered it obsolete. Yet its contribution was no less vital for never having fired a shot in anger. By standing ready, it helped prevent a conflict that might have destroyed civilizations. In this sense, the Peacemaker fully lived up to its name, a weapon whose power lay not in warfighting, but in the fragile peace it helped to preserve.